Before I do my introduction as the host of this program, I want to do an introduction as a representative of the organizations that are hosting this event, the National Liberty Museum and the Foreign Policy Research Institute. You are here tonight at the National Liberty Museum, which has hosted Geopolitics with Granieri and a number of FPRI programs over the past several years. We are always delighted to be here in this room with this assemblage of individuals. We're very grateful to the National Liberty Museum, and we thank you for coming tonight. As you know, if you're here, but if you're watching this on video, perhaps you don't know. The Foreign Policy Research Institute is Philadelphia's foreign policy think tank, established in 1955 by Ambassador Robert Strauss-Hupé. It has been engaged, FPRI has been engaged in both primary research on foreign affairs, policy research on foreign affairs, and public education, public and civic education on foreign affairs and on American history. Events like the one tonight are made possible by the generosity of FPRI's members and partners. If you are currently a member or partner of FPRI, we thank you intensely for that. If you are interested in supporting the work of FPRI and becoming a member or partner, please let us know, and we will be delighted to add you to the roster of delightful and generous people who make programs like this possible. Thank you. Having said that, ladies and gentlemen, it is Tuesday in Philadelphia, and the world is as complicated as ever. So let's talk about it. Welcome to the March 2019 edition of Geopolitics with Granieri, FPRI's monthly discussion of international affairs. I'm Ron Granieri, Executive Director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West, your host and moderator of tonight's discussion. All of us at FPRI, thank you for joining us today, whether on the internet or live this evening on March the 12th, 2019 at the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia. It is a pleasure to have you all with us. Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, as Barry Goldwater once declared. That may be, though the statement hinges quite a bit on the definition of liberty and on who gets to provide that definition. For extremism is a threat to the stability of societies, especially as individual extremists pursue their aims without concern for the values or interests of those whom they label outsiders or threats. Even if extremist ideologies sometimes refrain from violence, they hobble the practices of everyday democratic governance by delegitimizing the compromises and forbearance that makes democratic systems work. Even if they fail to win the day, extremists endanger civil society. Indeed, the failure of extremists to gain their ends through democratic governance feeds anger that ultimately leads to violence, which becomes a clear and present danger to the liberty of all. Our guest tonight has spent his career attempting to understand political extremism, both in his latest book, Extremism, in the MIT Press Essential Knowledge series, and in a series of research papers and magazine articles on specific movements and individuals, from ISIS and Al-Qaeda to Timothy McVeigh and Anders Breivik. His efforts to understand both the motivations of extremists and the possible responses available to free societies offer valuable insights for both policymakers and the general public. Any effort to construct a definition of extremism that covers all those variations that I mentioned is open to criticism, but the effort is worthwhile if it helps all of us to understand a world where too many seek the comfort of extremist clarity over the frustrating challenges of a complex world. So how should we understand extremism? What is the relationship between extremism and violence? How, if at all, can or should societies work to limit the appeal of extremist ideologies? These questions, and yours, will guide us tonight in conversation with our guest, J.M. Berger. J.M. Berger is a research fellow with VoxPol and a consultant to social media companies, security companies, and government agencies. He has conducted research and training on issues related to homegrown terrorism, online extremism, advanced social media analysis, and countering violent extremism. Research interests he is also currently pursuing as a PhD candidate at Swansea University School of Law. In addition to extremism, he is co-author with Jessica Stern of ISIS, the State of Terror, and author of Jihad Joe, Americans Who Go to War in the Name of Islam. He has published widely in the Atlantic and Politico, co-authored and authored several groundbreaking studies on social media analysis, including the development of metrics for measuring influence, community detection, and detecting the use of manipulative tactics online. A leading scholar on extremism in all its forms, we are delighted to have him with us tonight. Welcome, J.A. Berger.
Thank you.
So in your book, Extremism, you attempt to broaden and explain our definition of the term. So how do you define it? Is there a meaningful difference between the extremism of organized regimes, such as Rome's violent revenge on Carthage, and that of non-state actors?
Well, in crafting a definition for extremism, I was trying to really address a gap in the literature. Mm-hmm. So everybody writes about extremism, they write about extremist movements, but nobody had a definition that everybody else used. Everybody basically create their own ad hoc definition for the term. And for me, because I had come up in studying this, looking at both jihadism and domestic right-wing extremism, I wanted something that could encapsulate the way those are the same. We intuitively know that they're both extremism, but they're very different in how they manifest themselves. So what makes them the same? So the definition that I came up with is that it uses terms from social psychology. So the two key terms are in-group and out-group. Mm-hmm. The in-group is the group to which one belongs. So it's not necessarily like a group in power or the cool group or anything like that. It's just the group to which you belong. Mm-hmm. And the out-group is people who are excluded from the in-group. Mm-hmm. So the definition that I came up with is that extremism is the belief that the health and success of the in-group can only be achieved through hostile action against an outgroup. So it's not extremist to see yourself as white or black or Christian or Muslim. It's extremist to believe that you cannot successfully be white or successfully be Christian or successfully be Muslim unless you're taking action against people who are not.
Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of an old joke from George Carlin said that, have you ever noticed that when you're driving, everybody who's driving slower than you is an idiot and faster than you is a maniac? And so the problem that extremism is also, I'm fascinated how you take the definition of extremism away from, make it less positional. So it's not that that you're more extreme than I am on a particular question. It is how your political activity manifests itself. And so do you feel as though your definition has policy implications that the sort of positional definition of extremism does not?
Yeah, I think, the problem with the term extremism and the failure to define it is that everybody who's not you is some kind of extremist. Mm-hmm. So if somebody doesn't agree with you, it's because their positions are extreme. So all the definitions that existed before had some kind of problem. They're circular. Mm-hmm. Extremism is it being extreme, or they were relative. So the British Countering Extremism program uses a definition that says that extremism is being counter to British values, but British values aren't a fixed thing. Right. My litmus test for this has always been if you have a definition of extremism that excludes the Nazis at any point in their history, then you should rethink that definition.
Well, while you talk about specific things and what you include in the definition, this is actually something, because in your book, and your broader research generally, right, you cover organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and various white supremacist militias. You also talk about lone wolf attackers like the Unabomber or Anders Breivik. To get into the old debate among scholars between lumpers and splitters, right? If lumpers look for broad patterns and splitters look for the particular. Is it possible that a definition of extremism that tries to cover all of these different types of extremists, is there a danger that it becomes too broad and it doesn't define anything?
Well, there is, and I tried to take care of that.
Uh-huh.
It's an interesting question because in various stages of learning about this subject, I've gone from being a lumper to a splitter to a lumper again. Sort of when I first got started looking at Al-Qaeda and jihadist movements, back in the years shortly after 9/11, I and many other people had sort of an attitude that everything's Al-Qaeda, right? You know, so Abu Sayyaf group in the Philippines is Al-Qaeda because they took Al-Qaeda money. And over time, I started to see that as a real problem. You know, I started to see that these differences really matter, and I started to really start splitting things and looking at each of these things as a sort of independent element, which really came to a head with the ISIS and ISIS's break with Al-Qaeda. But then, you know, over time, really, I kept coming back to the question of, you know, we look at all these kinds of organizations, whether they're all jihadist or whether they're jihadist and right-wing and left-wing and anarchist and fascist, and how do we talk about these things as being related to each other? Because we understand they're related to each other in some way. And we need a framework that lets us talk about the things they have in common, because that can really help us understand what's going on.
And I guess this is, because one of the interesting things of any social science research is you have to analyze an event, a movement, a person, without being captured by how they define themselves. Right. So if you know, Anders Breivik, did he think of himself as an extremist? Did he? He
might have accepted that characterization. People have different attitudes about the relationship, the labels they choose for themselves. So some people are very comfortable calling themselves extremists. Some people are not. So, you know, one thing that I saw as I was coming up working on jihadism is there were a large, noisy body of people that has slowly grown who called themselves counter-extremists. They called themselves counter-jihadists, and they interpreted that as being anti-Islam. They were fighting against Islam because they were counter-extremists, and so that was one of the moments where I really started to feel like, you know, we need better resolution on this term, because, you know, it's easy to abuse. Extremists like to portray themselves as they're the ones fighting the real extremists. So what I tried to do really with this definition is make something that was sort of ideologically blind. It doesn't have a left-right focus. It doesn't have an up-down, west-east, you know, it's something that really kind of get down to the sort of these bare principles, and then you take these bare principles. It's, you know, when we talk about lumping, the flaws of lumping, you take these bare principles and then you use them as a guideline to interpret what the groups specifically believe. So it's, you know, as a very high-level definition, this isn't necessarily extremely useful, except in making your taxonomy and, you know, figuring out what your bestiary of extremists is going to be.
Well, and in making it ideologically agnostic, right, and wanting to avoid getting in any directions, in your work you include both state and non-state actors, which to someone who's used to reading about extremism in the context of terrorism, we always associate it with non-state actors. And so how do you see the role of governments and states generally as factors in this extremist universe?
I sort of come back to the Nazis, right?
Right.
We need,
sooner or later, we always do, right?
There's, you know, people may or may not like, you know, a comparison, a landscape that includes like Nazis and Al-Qaeda in the same category. But it might be easier for people to sort of wrap their heads around the fact that Nazis and neo-Nazis are obviously related to each other. And neo-Nazis are non-state actors. They're extremists. If they're extremists, why aren't Nazis extremists? So,
fair enough. Well, and the question of making comparisons across historical time is also of interest to me. Because you do start your book when you talk about your first example of extremism is the Roman decision to destroy Carthage as a city, right? Not just to defeat them or conquer the territory, but actually to wipe the city out. And yet, one could make the argument that in the ancient world, and until relatively recently, or in some ways maybe ongoing, that in warfare there can be levels of violence that are far beyond what individuals would consider to be normal, and yet have changing cultural mores about warfare changed our approach to understanding what constitutes sort of extreme violence? Like, did the Romans consider the destruction of Carthage extreme?
I think, you know, it's not extremely well documented, and I am not a Roman history expert. What I tried to do is really survey a wide range of things.
Sure.
But some people at the time did see the attitude toward Carthage as being extreme. Yeah, and really, you know, the level of actual violence that's executed is not as relevant to my definition as the intentional part of it. So Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. That insistence on the necessity of that hostile action in order to secure the health of the in-group. And I'll say, in the first chapter, I cover a lot of ground in there. And those are, to some extent, conversation pieces. Like, I have an opinion about all of them, but, you know, but they're sort of, it's sort of meant to show the variety of manifestations of this behavior and ask people to consider whether, do you think, you know, the destruction of Carthage was extremist. And I would say that, you know, the rhetoric around Carthage is not necessarily documented enough for us to be very definitive about it.
Well, because I was thinking along those lines, if it's about intentionality, to use a hypothetical, right? American nuclear war strategy is based on the idea that in the event of a strategic nuclear exchange, we would completely obliterate not just one Carthage, but hundreds of Carthages. Now, is that just an example of you know? But it could be done in cold blood, essentially, right? In pursuit of a strategy that's written out that is sort of, in any moral sense, it is extreme. But in a strategic, practical, decision-making sense, it could actually be very much the mainstream strategic decision. And so this is where I wonder about when we use terms like extremism to apply to state action. Are we making a moral distinction that and that's because, you know, extremism. You know, I like the idea of wanting extremism to be a morally neutral term, but you know, but it's rare that somebody says, you know, I'm an extremist. You know, if I call you an extremist, it's rare that somebody says, "Thanks very much, I appreciate it."
Yeah, you know, the nuclear deterrent is complicated, and it's not. There's certainly a strategic ideology behind it, but I'm not sure it's ideological in its implementation. So, and we haven't, knock wood, had a nuclear war yet,
so far.
you know, with the exception of the very first use of nuclear weapons. So to some extent, you know, if extremism is the necessity of hostile action, you know, that ultimate hostile action hasn't been taken. Now, if you believe that you need to have nuclear weapons because God wants you to burn the earth in fire and rid it of the infidels, then that's extremist.
That would be extremist. Yeah. So, okay. To step back from that particular apocalypse, our mutual colleague Clint Watts, with whom you've collaborated on Hamilton 68, right? This metric of fake news. He's often commented on how respectable politicians can provide oxygen for extremist groups by talking about the issues that motivate extremists. Or even by choosing to focus on those issues to score political points in a campaign or whatever. If we assume that many extremist groups draw on real problems, even if their solutions might be extremist, and to draw on legitimate concerns, how, if at all, should the rest of us discuss those issues in ways that are, you know, that do not give extra oxygen to extremists?
So there are three components to an extremist ideology. The identity, which is the in-groups and the out-groups. And then the postulation that there's some kind of crisis. So there's a terrible crisis. And a crisis isn't always a threat, but it usually is. A crisis means that an important decisive action must be taken. And then there's the solution to a crisis. And to meet the definition of extremism, you need all three of these components, and the solution has to be hostile action against the outgroup that must be maintained at all times in order to keep the in-group safe. So if you have, so having laws about immigration is something that countries do. It's not inherently extremist. If you stipulate that there's a crisis around immigration, then extremists can exploit that to argue for their solution, which comes in the form of hostile action. So so there's a number of things that politicians can do in this respect that can really aggravate the problem. First, they can just create a crisis formulation, and then extremists can take that crisis formulation and utilize it to their own benefit. And you know, at some point you have to sort of get down to the ground truth level on this and say, is there actually a crisis or not? If there's not a crisis, then that's even more utility to extremists, really. It creates a problem where there wasn't one, and then the extremists can take that and run with it. And we have certainly seen that since the 2016 presidential campaign. White nationalists have seized on this concept of an immigration crisis and seized on this rhetoric and really amplified it. So they take the crisis and then they extend it to their solution, which is to create a white ethno-state or to end all immigration, to expel people who are here from their homes, their countries. So, you know, what happens in mainstream politics definitely resonates with what happens in extremist politics. And the more crisis narratives are available, the more extremists can exploit it. And in our current environment, this 24/7 news cycle and the social media turbine that's just like churning out content day in and day out, what we're seeing is that extremist movements can often be very nebulous. They can just take that crisis formulation and amplify the crisis formulation and amplify it and leave the hostile solution implied. Or they can have a sometimes bewildering set of in-group, out-group definitions. Who's, you know, who's an American? You know, who's eligible to be an American? And all of these pieces, I sometimes liken it to like a bag of Legos. That you just like throw a bunch of Legos into a bag and then they can take the pieces and put it together into a construction that suits them.
That suits them. No. Well, related to that, in your excellent paper, which I recommend to anybody who's interested in extremist literature, The Turner Legacy, you talk about the continuing salience of the dystopian novel, The Turner Diaries. It inspired Timothy McVeigh and others. And your most recent piece in The Atlantic talks about Anders Breivik and the power of extremist manifestos, right? And in both cases, right, we have this interesting question of what do we do with pieces of writing that may have some kind of intrinsic interest, but also are specifically designed to encourage extremism and may actually inspire violence. How should a free and open society, which encourages the spread of different ideas, how should it handle expressions of dangerous ideas like that? So how do we, do we go in for trigger warnings, or what should we do to give people the option to read these things, but also to try to mitigate their potential damage?
So we're really in the throes of a crisis on this subject right now. The changes in communications technology over the last 20 years have really fundamentally reshaped a lot of elements of speech. So prior to the rise of the internet, extremists could put out literature, but that literature would usually have a pretty limited reach. For instance, during the 80s, there were cable access shows, that different white supremacists did in locations around the country, and the only people who saw them were in a county area. There were videotapes. There was extremist propaganda on video, just like there is now, jihadist and right-wing and everything else. But they had to be carried around. They were expensive to make. They had to be carried around, distributed manually. So all of this content was able to exist under our free speech guidelines because it was limited in scope. Because it didn't have a strong mainstream appeal, it couldn't reach a large audience. And the internet, and particularly social media, have dramatically changed that. So now everybody's got a TV station in their pocket, basically. Anybody can be broadcasting to hundreds or thousands or millions of people just based on having a phone. And we regulate television, right? Mm-hmm. We regulate radio. And these platforms are not currently regulated. Not to get too in the weeds with it, but the laws that apply to social media platforms currently are the same as the laws that apply to the telephone. Mm-hmm. So you can't, the telephone company can't be held liable if I use telephone to call somebody up and order a murder. Mm-hmm. And it's clear at this point, I think, that social media is not like the telephone. But it's also not quite like television either. It's much more personal. It feels more like free expression. It feels more like the public square. So I think we're really struggling mm-hmm. to adapt to this new environment. And I don't know what the perfect answers are. But I think as far as the platforms, the social platforms, there's a pretty clear public interest in having some kind of regulation and liability. Not, you know, a draconian crackdown, but the platforms have some responsibility to manage what happens on the platforms.
And how do you evaluate the degree of self-regulation or self-understanding that's been displayed by, say, Mark Zuckerberg?
Yeah, so...
just to pick a name at random.
Yeah. So what we have right now is governance by bad headlines. So when the headlines get bad enough, then the social media companies do something about the particular problem. Mm-hmm. It's ad hoc, and the rules are not consistent. And each of the three big social media companies, Google, Twitter, and Facebook, are at different places in dealing with this problem. Facebook has by far put the most resources into it, although not necessarily getting the best outcomes for those resources. Twitter has been extremely disengaged from this, really doesn't want to be in the business of regulating what happens on the platform, but they have improved it significantly, and Google is somewhere in between those two. They've taken some very clear and effective steps, and then they still have a lot of work to do. Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the civil libertarian response to this is it makes that it's simply wrong to try to tell people what they can and cannot say, that we have to wait until they do something and then punish them for doing it. Has anything, what if anything, do you think has changed with the rise of social media that should alter that civil libertarian position, or as a counter to that position?
I think, you know, the thing that, if anything, tipped this over the edge mm-hmm. In terms of how we think about this as a society, it was ISIS mm-hmm. and its weaponization of social media. So mm-hmm. ISIS took these platforms, exploited them to the hilt in often very canny ways, and, you know, created an incredible amount of chaos in mm-hmm. the world as a result. And so that really kind of forced the issue. That was what caused people to stop being purely civil. And for a while, people were still making a civil libertarian argument for a while, as these videos of beheadings and were coming out and people were emulating them. And you know, some people still do make that argument. I think that the First Amendment promises us that you can't go to jail just for saying something, just for expressing free speech within certain reasonable limitations. Direct incitement of violence has always been an exception to that. Right. A lot of that activity that we've seen in the first wave of crackdowns was this direct incitement to violence. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of easy. I always say ISIS was the easy problem here because they were so over the top. You know, extreme graphic violence, extreme violence by its adherents, and abuse of the platform by using automation and other kinds of tricks. So going after ISIS was a no-brainer, mm-hmm. relatively speaking, and even that took a couple years to actually happen. Right. And now we're getting into the nuanced discussions, and this is where things start to get hard, and the platforms are struggling with this, is, you know, okay, what if you're a white nationalist who wants a white ethno-state, but you're not directly calling for violence? Should that be allowed? And what if you belong to the KKK? You know, and all these questions are right now being litigated individually, but the companies are starting to try to come up with the broad guidelines. And so at this point, it looks to me, governments are starting to also want to put guidelines on this. So the companies are, I think, highly motivated to put forward a framework for dealing with this problem before people start legislating at them. And once those two sides, the government and private sector sides, kind of settle on something, then we're going to have to take it from there. Ultimately, the platforms that these companies provide, they feel like the public square. They feel like, you know, go out on the street and somebody's walking with a sign that says the end is near, and that's protected speech. But they're not. They're more like an auditorium or a theater or a, you know, and where we draw these lines is going to be really hard. Amazon is going to be the next big problem with this, because you can buy the Turner Diaries on Amazon. You can buy Breivik's Manifesto on Amazon. And they've recently had a big surge on on-demand videos, all kinds of extremist stuff. I saw something just this weekend, extremely anti-Semitic conspiracy video that was available for rental when I was cruising through the recommendations for, you know, I was looking for a movie to watch over the weekend, and then I'm like, whoa.
I don't like to think about what your recommendations must look like on your Google searches.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
I have one more question for you before I turn to the crowd, so I hope you're warming up for your questions. And this is, it's one thing to talk about the role of bad actors, you know, who have a particular agenda. And so we have bad actors on one side, we have these relatively feckless or disengaged platforms on the other. But what about the role of trolls? Those who don't necessarily support any of the particular agendas of the extremist groups, but are more than happy to push the ideas just to cause trouble. And this, based on your work with Clint and your other work as well, on the role of the Russians, for example, in just wanting, you know, they don't care whether anybody wins or loses, but they just want to cause trouble. This is it's a problem in individual conversations. If anybody who's engaged in any discussion on Facebook or Twitter and knows what happens when somebody's just decided they're going to troll, they're going to cause trouble, outside of telling people to learn some manners, what exactly can or should platforms do to limit the influence of mischief makers and trolls?
So, to some extent, there are two separate problems. There's state-sponsored campaigns, which are seeking to destabilize adversaries, and then there are people denizens of the internet who live in the shadows and just like to cause trouble. Right. Where you can really take effective action, I think, is looking at the use of automation and what we call astroturfing. So when you're creating a large presence of fake accounts, that is clearly a violation of the terms of service of these companies to do that, and they really have an impact. You know, these accounts make it look like, you know, you go online and you might think that there's, you know, 100 million Nazis in this country, when probably there's only 5 million, maybe. So
that makes me feel so much better.
So I think that, you know, before we get into any of the difficult questions, I think that you know, the companies can probably have already done a lot and can do more to deal with astroturfing, and then, which is done not just by state actors, but also by people in the alt-right and people on message boards. And I think if you tackle that problem, which is kind of, you can do that in a technical way, right, then then you move on to the really hard questions.
Everybody may be familiar with the famous New Yorker cartoon of a dog sitting at a computer and says, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog.
Yep.
That's both the good and the bad, right? To you are whoever you claim to be. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking for a question from there. So I have one right here up front. Wait till the microphone will come to you. Latay's coming up the aisle. And then if you'll speak into the microphone and ask your question. Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to bring up what I think is extremism around the country in universities. I'm a professor at Columbia University, and I have to say that what's happening under the terminology of social justice is in fact making most white students feel guilty and shame because they're called white privilege. And because, you know, Columbia students are international and they come from all over the world, I mean, I've had graduate students in my office crying because they really feel they can't speak up if they're not a minority and if they're white privilege. So I think that it's very easy to talk about extremism on the other side, but I think something is going on in the university that's splitting our country apart. Right. And I find it very painful and upsetting.
Well, I mean, the patterns we talked about, right? In-group, out-group, a sense of crisis, a sense of justified grievance, which gives people, they feel as though they have carte blanche to behave any way they want against the people they disagree with. If this is true on the left as well as on the right, if it's true among university students as well as among anybody else, how does a society overcome that? Or how does a society challenge that while also respecting people's right to be obnoxious?
So, it's complicated. So, without having direct knowledge of the situation at this school, what I will say is that it is not extremist to seek justice for your people. Mm-hmm. So Black Lives Matters is often something that's brought up. People, that's the question I usually get at least once at an event. Mm-hmm. And Black Lives Matters is asking for justice, for fair treatment under the law, that, you know, it's not insisting that white people have to be put into camps. It's not trying to overthrow the system. It's not extremist. Mm-hmm. So in terms of, you know, this sort of campus discussion, I have an opinion on that, but from an extremist point of view, I think people can robustly disagree up to a point. But there are things that you can do verbally. One thing I tried to do in the book is talk about nonviolent solutions that extremists put out, because, you know, we understand that things like segregation, for instance, are extremist, but they're not terrorism. So, you know, and we need to understand that extremism can involve different things, and what we see, you know, you see online particularly, you can see very organized patterns of harassment. Mm-hmm. So if people believe that if people are part of a group that they identify as their in-group, whether it's racial or otherwise, and they believe that they must be taking hostile action against people who are in a different group, that's extremism. But debating these issues is not necessarily extremism. I see a tremendous amount of discussion about campus speech that I find baffling, to be honest. And you know, I think that there are a lot of much more direct problems that we see going on. And honestly, you know, there is certainly extremism can come from minorities. There are Black nationalist groups. The video I mentioned on Amazon was by a Black nationalist group, actually. Mm-hmm. It happens. But when you look at the numbers, and particularly when you look at the death tolls and violence, the vast majority of violence and extremism in this country right now is coming from the right. In 1973, it was coming from the left. So these things are cyclical. They come and go. And I think that the conditions are pretty ripe for a resurgence of left-wing extremism at this point. But I haven't seen a lot of evidence in the form of dead bodies to support that. So
fair enough. Question right here in the back? Yes. Yep, right there. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening. I just want to push you on your definition of extremism a bit. After Hitler declared war on the United States declared war on Nazi Germany and demanded unconditional surrender, not just cessation of hostilities, but the tearing apart of the regime. Doesn't that meet your definition of extremism? If not, why not? And if it does, do you want to catch that?
So what my goal with this definition was to reduce the number of gray areas, and it's very difficult to eliminate all of them. When we get into discussions about war, something like that is sort of problematic when you're talking about it in this context. What I would say is that the United States did not try to obliterate Germany and did not want a permanent occupation of Germany. So war can be tricky when we're talking about thinking about it in extremist ways. If you're waging a war against another country because you believe that that country is always going to be a threat to you and you can never stop the war, an endless war, and the phrase "forever war" raises a lot of questions about what we're doing right now that get into these uncomfortable areas. I would have liked to have a definition that could perfectly address all of these gray areas, and I did not end up with one. I'm not sure if one's possible. One area that is similarly complicated, I think, is if you look at Antifa. So Antifa is like anti-fascist, right? So they're opposed to fascists, definitionally opposed to fascists. Does that make them extremists? And it gets complicated. So, when we talk about the counter-jihadists, their definition of what they're doing is countering extremism is very broad. And you can see, and I don't want to get too into the weeds about stuff that's in the book, but there are I introduced some breakdowns of in-groups and out-groups that are helpful to sort of try and get at the differences between these things.
I was thinking as a historical matter, right, that there's a distinction between unconditional surrender, which says surrender without, there's not going to be a negotiated truce. That even in 1944, right, Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau actually proposed a plan to permanently pastoralize Germany. Wow. Which was the so-called Morgenthau Plan, which was, flood the mines, destroy the factories, Delenda-esque. And that was rejected by the Roosevelt administration. It was rejected by Winston Churchill in part because it was considered extreme.
Yeah.
And so, that there are limits. But that's but I think about that because this is a problem with, my nuclear weapons question, right, is that the decision to use the atomic bomb, while could be seen as part of a continuum of warfare against civilians, against cities, just a difference of degree rather than kind. But at what point does a difference in degree become so great that we've gone from just moving from firebombing to atomic bombing, that we can consider it to be a kind of extremism, right? And I guess that's where it always gets hard, right? Just figure out where do we draw these lines?
It is. It's a good question, and it is hard. And I think that there are some things that can be helpful when you're sort of thinking about it. One is the formulation of war. Can you see peace? Can you see a negotiated peace? Is it conditional in some way? And so then when we talk about the Nazi regime versus Germany versus Germans, there's a distinction you can make between what I call the extremist in-group, which is an extremist organization, and the eligible in-group, which is people who are eligible to join the extremist organization. So Germans broadly are the eligible in-group, and what you can see sometimes when people are trying to counter extremists is they will focus, where they put their focus is really instructive in sort of trying to figure out whether it's an extremist in intent. So are you focused on the extremist in-group or are you focused on the eligible in-group?
Yeah, it's a good distinction. Let's go right up here to the front. Do we have a, oh, here comes Latay with the microphone. She's coming.
So in my mind, I see that there are good extremists and there are bad extremists. That the the Patriots in 1776, who rebelled against the Tories and the British, were good extremists. The Nazis were bad extremists. Are there different rules, or should there be different rules that apply to the behavior of good extremists versus bad extremists? And what makes a good extremist versus a bad extremist, other than beauty being in the eyes of the beholder?
So that's a good question. Yeah. So one of the things that I tried to get at with this is a definition that didn't make all efforts at independence or liberation of somebody automatically classify them as extremist. So the difference, I think, between what happened in 1776 versus war with Nazi Germany is that the Patriots were fighting for independence, for self-rule, and they were not fighting to obliterate the British. They wanted the British control to end, but they were, up until the point that the war started, they were themselves British. So, and they would have identified themselves that way. So I think that having a political goal that is conditional is a different process from having an extremist goal, which, for the Nazis, which is an unconditional persecution of Jews and other minorities. And, you know, again, as I said, my goal was to reduce the gray areas, not to eliminate them. I wouldn't put the Revolutionary War into the extremist basket because I didn't see that unconditional need for hostility. They also, you know, there was a period of negotiation and demand that took place. They didn't just jump ahead to the hostile action. They said, these are our grievances, here they are, we want this. Similarly with the abolitionists, for instance, there were some violent abolitionists and people, I had a...
John Brown, for example.
Sure. I had a number of interesting arguments about slavery in this context. People arguing that slavery was not extremist because of a relativistic definition that was integrated in the society. And what I would say is that people can be violent and not necessarily fit this definition of extremists. People can be violent revolutionaries, they can be vigilantes, they can be, you know, engage in different kinds of political violence, and it's not all political violence is extremist. For the abolitionists, I think, you know, you can look at it and see pretty clearly that they were focused on the practice of slavery. They wanted to end the practice of slavery. They were not trying to destroy the slaveholders. Some of the stuff that happened in Reconstruction, you know, maybe had more of a retributive kind of quality to it, but the goal of abolition was not, you know, we need to put all the slaveholders into camps. It was, we want to end this practice. So, again, and these questions are really good, and I've been surprised actually. I anticipated a lot of these questions, and I haven't heard that many of them from people in the course of talking about the book. So, you know, there are definitely gray areas. One thing you can do, the book gets into a much more complicated framework of things, types of crisis that extremists describe and types of solution. When you have a case that falls into a gray area, you can sort of drill down into these things and look at these particular questions. And I've worked on this with helping people who are trying to tackle the problem of this definition for practical reasons, that we need to create a law or a policy that deals with this. And, you know, so when it's ambiguous, when you have somebody who might be a freedom fighter versus being an extremist, you look for other things. Is there a crisis definition that falls into the typical extremist crisis definitions, like apocalyptic or you know, dystopian crisis? Or are people describing it as conditional crisis? Are they saying, you know, we need to change these conditions, and then when these conditions come, our need for violence will end? So, you know, when you get into what I tried to do in here, in really when I get into the weeds of this question, is to provide tools to tackle some of these individual nuanced questions one by one and sort of look at the context.
Fair enough. In the back, right here. Sorry.
Yeah, good evening. Can you please elaborate on the difference between jihad or jihadism as interpreted by Islam and then was vis-a-vis how it is being used by extremists or terrorists to use jihad in their, to further their cause?
So jihadism, modern jihadism, is the actual term jihad and the concept of holy war and the concept of justified war in religion is something that all religions have some version of. What jihadists do is they draw very sharp lines around the in-groups and the out-groups. And one thing that extremists do in general is they really work to define who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group. And they make these definitions as concrete as possible, and they spend a lot of time developing the rules for who's in and who's out. Jihadist groups have a lot of those rules, so depending on which one you're talking about, the rules may be slightly different. If it's Al-Qaeda, non-Muslims are the out-group that they're really targeting most intensely, with a sort of secondary, softer focus on Shia Muslims versus Sunni Muslims. And so that hostile action that has to be taken, the actual concept of jihad is kind of just a way of articulating hostile action in this context. It has other meanings within the religion. And then you take a group like ISIS, and ISIS greatly increased the number of outgroups, and they changed the focus. So they're much more intensely focused on Shia Muslims than on the West. And they are currently, what we're seeing with ISIS is that under the pressure that they've been facing in the loss of territory, they are actually starting to eat themselves alive at this point. So their in-group, out-group definitions are becoming even more restrictive to the point where you know, they have this argument, it's a technical religious argument about something called chain takfir, which means that jihadists in general believe that people who aren't good Muslims by their definition should be excommunicated, and then they can be subject to hostile action. And ISIS is currently snared in a debate about whether people who are ignorant of takfir should also be excommunicated. So they're getting very close to the sort of maximum radicalization of the in-group, out-group dynamic, where everybody who's not actually in ISIS is subject to hostile action and violence and can be killed.
Interesting. Right here.
Is it your position that extremism as a sort of a category is increasing, and that social media manipulations can create more extremists, or if you believe in the chaos that much of the social media mischief has produced, is extremism what you might call emergent behavior of a chaotic situation?
I love that question. So I think
we aim to please here at Geopolitics.
So I'll break it into two pieces. I do think extremism is increasing at the moment. It's cyclical. It comes and goes. Conditions, one thing I talk about in the last chapter of the book is uncertainty tends to create conditions where people are more susceptible to extremism. And the rise of social media in particular, as well as other factors, is we're in a time of great uncertainty. There's a lot of things that are sort of up in the air, and people are more susceptible than ever. And I think that social media specifically enables extremists in a lot of technical and not so technical ways. I think that social media is a realm where emergent behavior is definitely observed. I think that what we've seen is really the complexity of social media. When you have a network that's literally 2 billion people, all of whom have between 2,000 and 5,000 connections to other people on the platforms, a lot of unexpected stuff happens. And it's easy and I think to some extent fair to sort of jab at the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world and say, you know, when they say, oh, we never saw this coming, you know, I think one could have seen some of this coming, but at the same time, a lot of these sort of specific campaigns are things that really we only recognized when we saw them. So when ISIS started to do this really kind of synchronized, manipulative campaign, creating bots and putting this false stuff out there, you know, that was unexpected. I didn't see that coming. I think that, you know, as the world becomes more interconnected, emergence, I think, relates to the difficulty of predicting where it's going to come from. So if you had asked me 10 years ago that whether we were going to see Buddhists committing genocide, I would have been surprised to hear that. But that's what we got now. Right.
Things are only inevitable in retrospect. Yeah. Right. We have one last question from the audience right here.
I want to leave here understanding your definition. Maybe the best thing to do is to buy the book. But in the meantime, my question is this. In terms of the attitude of the in-group to the out-group, the extremists, you've used the term hostility, you've used the term obliterate, you've used the term destroy, and you also, on a couple of occasions, mentioned you used the term dead bodies. In order for the organization or the group to be an extremist group, must their intention be to create dead bodies? Because I can envision a situation where destroying the other group does not involve killing the other group. And the answer, it seems to me, would pertain to what might in the future represent the restrictions on free speech.
Yeah, so it's a great question. It is not limited to violence, to dead bodies. Dead bodies are the flashing red siren that says that we've got a huge problem with an extremist movement. So when violence is coming, you know, we naturally prioritize that. But one thing that I deliberately did in the book is try to talk about the many kinds of sub-violent behavior that extremists can claim to support or actually support. And what we see is that these kind of sub-violent behaviors often lead to more violence. So harassment I used as an example. We talk about extremism as a spectrum in the book, so it's not always, you know, genocidal. It's not always apocalyptic. It can be low level. Because you want to be able to think about these things and look at these groups and study them before they're carrying out genocide, before they're killing people, carrying out terrorism. So, you know, what we can see right now, for instance, in anti-Semitic violence, for instance, related to online activity, is that we see people engaged in very active, aggressive campaigns of harassment and anti-Semitic content, distribution of that kind of content. Most of those people aren't violent, but as that content surges, we see a rise in that kind of violence. So I think that there's, what I hope to do with the book, to some extent, is create some tools to start thinking about how can we diagnose problems before they get to that point. And how can we understand behaviors that are not physical violence, things that are structural violence, like structural discrimination or segregation or oppression, slavery. You know, slavery was one that I got a tremendous amount of pushback, actually, at various stages in this project, because people didn't really want to concede that that was connected, that the ideology behind slavery was connected to white supremacism today. And to me, they're very clearly connected, and I wanted to be able to sort of talk about that spectrum of behaviors in a way. So there is definitely a lot going on in these areas, and it can be, you know, you can kind of take the low-level types of extremism that I talk about in here, and you can find examples of that everywhere. Not everything constitutes a crisis for our society, and not everything requires the same level of policing and pushback. I think certainly when things get to the point of violence, that's when you really need to start taking aggressive actions to try and deal with it. But I think there's a lot of stuff that happens before that that's helpful for us to understanding where the next movement's going to come from, and understanding, you know, what can we try and do to get out ahead of it before it escalates.
Okay. Well, and one way to do that, ladies and gentlemen, is to read Extremism by J.M. Berger. That's all the time we have for tonight, but thank you, J.M. Berger, for sharing your thoughts with us. FPRI would especially like to thank the National Liberty Museum for hosting us tonight and the Stanley and Arlene Ginsberg Family Foundation for their generous support for this program. Today's conversation was particularly rich, but it is just the beginning. The world goes on, and every month we will have a discussion here about it here at Geopolitics with Granieri. If you have enjoyed our discussion today, tell a friend, and bring a friend next time when we will gather to analyze our complex world. To keep up with our future episodes of Geopolitics with Granieri and other events at FPRI, visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our email lists. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter, @Ronald Until next time, for all of us at FPRI, especially the capable staff at PWP Video back there in the room, and my FPRI colleagues in producing this broadcast, Eli Gilman and Jessica Taylor, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us. Good night. Thanks, John. That was fun.